Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been holding all our author talks since last spring, when the pandemic forced us to abandon in-person events. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Donald Trump versus the United States by Michael Schmidt. Michael Schmidt started as a news clerk at the New York Times 15 years ago, answering phones on the foreign desk before becoming a sports reporter at the paper, covering doping and off-the-field issues. He went on to report on the war in Iraq, and on the Pentagon, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. In recent years, his work has focused on national security and federal investigations. He was part of two New York Times teams that won Pulitzer Prizes in 2018, one for reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues, and the other for coverage of Donald Trump and his campaign's ties to Russia. In his new book, Michael recounts Trump's abuse of presidential power by focusing primarily on two individuals who sought to confront the president and constrain him, former FBI Director James Comey and former White House counsel Donald McGinn. More than the story of what Trump and his enablers did, though, this is a story of central insider attempts to stop him. Michael has a reputation for meticulous reporting and great access to sources, and his book reflects those qualities. The New York Times review called it, quote, a revelatory portrait of the events that led to the investigation of Trump for obstruction of justice. And a Washington Post review said the book, quote, offers a powerful accounting of the lawlessness and chaos that is President Trump. Now, in a show of true collaborative spirit between the New York Times and the Washington Post, Michael will be in conversation this evening with Ashley Parker, a White House reporter for the Post. Actually, Ashley has some inside knowledge of the New York Times. She worked there 11 years before joining the Post 3 years ago. Many of you also may recognize her from appearances as a contributor on NBC News and MSNBC. So Michael and Ashley, the screen is yours.
Great.
So I should just let everyone know at the outset, at least, that when it comes to Mike Schmidt, I'm actually everything you don't want in a journalist, which is wildly biased and full of opinions. Mike and I started at the New York Times together the exact same year in 2005 in the exact same job, which was the lowest job you could be, a news clerk, and we both worked our way up. I actually attended the famous 30th birthday party at Stetson's in DC that Mike writes about in his book. He and I spent a fairly memorable New Year's Eve week trapped at Mar-a-Lago covering President Trump. And I even once unsuccessfully set him up on a blind date with my younger sister, just different types. Which is all to say, I have known Mike as a competitor, a colleague, and a friend, and in all of those capacities, he's just a truly wonderful human, a fantastic reporter, and you should absolutely buy his book and buy it from Politics and Prose. So with that, I just want to...
That's really sweet of you. It's, there was no one else, when I was trying to think of who to do this with, I thought that if there was there's no more contemporary that I have than you, given our histories and when the chances that we had, like when we spent in Florida together, were just really wonderful times. So this is a fun way. This is the only book event I think I have, and I don't have a book party. So this is the closest thing. So I'm really excited to spend it with you.
So I just want to start, when I was reading your book, I did a double take at this paragraph. It wasn't even particularly notable. I think it's in the middle of a chapter in the middle of your book, but I just want to read it and ask you a question to get us started. So a week had passed since Trump became president. The FBI was investigating the president's campaign. The National Security Advisor had lied to the FBI. The president had asked the FBI director for his loyalty. The FBI director was keeping memos with the president whom he did not trust. And a significant portion of your book details that within the first 26 days of his administration, Donald Trump had basically done enough to completely and utterly imperil his presidency. So I thought that was a good place to get started.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to tell this story. And at one point, I thought about doing it just on the first 26 days of the administration, because I think that if you understand the first 26 days of the administration and how they dealt with this highly unusual problem of the national security advisor being potentially compromised by a foreign adversary, if you can understand that period of time, you can understand the Trump presidency. Because by the time of that 26th day, when the president clears the Oval Office and he asks Jim Comey to end the Flynn investigation, there is enough that has been created, because Comey goes home and writes a memo about it, that when that memo is disclosed, it will so rock the administration that they'll be forced to confront a true existential threat of an investigation into them. And I try to figure out, where do you start the book? Where do you end the book? If you understand the first 26 days, it also sort of answers the question of where to end the book. Because as I study the administration, you start to see the story starting to repeat itself. The president wants to do something. It's usually out of bounds and ethically or norms or legally, and the people around him have to respond. I'm sure that Deborah Birx's calculations about how she deals with the president around the pandemic are very similar to the ones that Jim Comey had to make decisions on, Don McGinn had to make decisions on, John Kelly had to make decisions on. The interesting part, the difference is that Trump, being this human MRI machine, shines a light onto these people, and it reveals them in different ways. Comey was never going to bend. He was never going to bend. He was never going to give in. It was never going to work. McGinn was going to try and make it work. McGinn had a once and a never again opportunity to remake the courts. So he was going to put up with some different things, but only to a certain point. And then you have some of the people still around the president, which you have to wonder, what have they done to be, to continue to be there?
And speaking of Comey and McGinn, the two men who really flesh out this book, they're not quite anti-heroes. They're not exactly heroes, but they are kind of deeply human Shakespearean characters who are up against forces much greater than them, forces that they sometimes don't even understand themselves. But they're two men also exerting tremendous influence in ways they don't even always understand or intend over the course of the presidency. And so I kind of wanted to talk about why you chose to focus on them, and if you could tell us just a little bit more about what you learned in this process about them.
So there's several reasons why I picked the two of them. One is that I think besides Trump and Obama, the decisions Comey made had more of an impact on how we live in the world today than anything. If you're a Democrat, you think that he helped get Donald Trump elected because of his handling of the email investigation. If you're a Trump supporter, you think that he created these memos to try and take down the Trump presidency and led to the appointment of Mueller. Those are like hugely things that have direct impacts on the world we live in today. McGinn will have an impact on us for decades to come, because McGinn remade the federal courts. And he didn't just remake them with traditional Republican judges. He remade them with some of the most conservative, youngest justices out there. And the impact of McGinn, that single hand, the fact that Trump would allow one person to serve essentially as a committee of one to nominate the judges, the unusualness of Trump colliding with the deep beliefs of McGinn, like we will be living with the impacts of that for a very long time. So historically, I thought that there was enough there that these two people, this isn't just an aide or something. These are people that have had enormously larger impacts. The second thing is there's a similarity to them that I thought was striking and made them compelling. They both thought they had it figured out, and then it got worse. And then it got worse and worse. They were lashed to the mast of the Trump ship. They were in the worst waters possible. And then it got worse. And then it got worse. And Comey thought, okay, I'm going to hold this press conference. I can tell that there's something off in the country about truth and facts, but if I hold this press conference, I'll put this issue to rest and we'll be able to move on. It's just as simple as that. Just follow that. Look, it's going to be painful. This is not a silver bullet, but this will make the problem better, and it's more likely we can move past it more quickly. He does that, and it sets him down a path where, by the time Trump becomes president on the 7th day of his presidency, Comey's sitting there. Trump's asking him for his loyalty. Here's Jim Comey, a guy who, when I interviewed him when I was covering the FBI, said in this interview right after he became director in his office for this story I was doing, he says, I said, well, would you play in Obama's basketball game? Comey's 6'8", and Obama's basketball game had been played in the basement of the FBI. And Comey said to me, this is obviously Obama's president. He says, no, I would never play. I would never play with him because there would be an appearance of being too close to the White House. Okay. So here he is on the 7th day of the presidency, alone with the president whose campaign he's investigating. He's asking for his loyalty. Jim Comey's life at that point was in a far different place than he ever dreamed it could have been when he holds the press conference, 6-7 months earlier. With McGinn comes in and he says, I'm going to do the judges. This thing with Russia, the campaign will deal with it. It's probably a bunch of nonsense. There's nothing there. Trump, he can play Reagan. He'll play Reagan, get into the trappings of the presidency, the ceremonies and the press conferences, and we'll just go out and ruthlessly execute his agenda and do it. And I'm just going to do the judges and be the White House counsel. It's just simple as that. 4 days into the presidency, Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, walks in his office and says, hey, you're the once in a generation problem. The national security advisor may be compromised by Russia. McGinn in that moment struggles, but it's a pretty difficult thing to deal with. And from there, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. But McGinn pushes through it.
And then going to Comey briefly, by the time you start writing your book in earnest, I assume Comey is ubiquitous. You've written about him more than anyone. He's all over the news. He's testified before Congress. He's written a memoir of his own. And so, how daunting was it, and how did you approach trying to tell the reader something new about Jim Comey that we didn't already know?
So Comey presented a pretty unique challenge from the perspective of trying to tell a story. Because, as you said, there had been so much written about him. And to understand the Comey story, you had to go back. He would talk about, come back to October 28th and see the world through my eyes. Well, I'm never going to be the FBI director. You're never going to be the FBI director. That's a pretty hard thing to relate to. I can understand the logic of how he got to where he was, but no one wanted to go back to October 28th with him. No one wanted to try and understand it. People, for lack of a better term, we just didn't want to hear it. And so I talked with the editors and the folk I was working on the book with. It was like, well, you have to write about Comey because I've written so much about Comey. Here's this historical figure. I would argue historical figure that I understand. So you're going to write a book. You're not going to write about Comey. And so I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And I thought, we got to come up with something different. There's got to be a different way to do this. And I thought, here's a way of trying to do it. Let's try and tell the story through his wife. Let's try and move the camera. We've all been looking at Comey on a 45-degree angle. Let's move the camera to a different direction. Let's try and see him through the eyes of someone else, because he's going to be hard to relate to as an FBI director, because we're never going to be the FBI director. But we all know what it's like. We all have loved ones, and we all know what it's like to watch a loved one go through something brutal. In this case, for Patrice Comey, her husband was being blamed for the election of Donald Trump, someone who Patrice Comey thought was awful, and someone who she thought her husband probably thought deep down inside was awful. And so we can relate as a reader to watching a loved one, in pain and struggle and feel like you have no control over that situation. And so I said, well, let's try and tell the story through Patrice. let's try and see Comey in a different light, because if we just tell the Comey story, we're going to lose the reader, because no one wants to hear what he has to say.
And then to the other character, Don McGinn, your book opens up, the first 25 pages or so are just this incredibly gripping cinematic scene of you. I mean, everyone will hopefully read about of him racing down the sidewalk in downtown Washington, trying to catch Don McGinn before he enters into the fortress of the White House. You finally catch him, you catch your breath, you begin talking to him outside the White House and basically trying to get him talking, keep him talking, and turn him into a source. And so selfishly, I'm curious if you can share a little bit about how do you make people who really should have no incentive whatsoever to talk to you in particular into sources?
Well, I think that you have to pull on the string of everyone wants to talk. No one wants to be identified for talking, but they want their story to be told and they want it to be done accurately. And almost everyone thinks that their story has not been accurately told. So a way of trying to come at someone and trying to talk to them is to just basically get out of the way, let them talk. People like to talk. They just like to hear themselves, and they like to think that someone's listening, and they like to correct the record. You know, a good, very comfortable way of talking to people is talking about, well, this story said this, or, they've said this about it. And then they want to correct it, because ultimately everyone thinks that there's something about them that's been written that's wrong, or the perception's wrong, or they've been wronged by this, and this wasn't fair, and this is what really happened, and you don't understand, and that kind of thing. And in the process of that, you get closer to the truth. You're also talking about things that are on the public record. So, like, let's say you're trying to, get someone to talk, some person inside the White House. Like, if you walk up to them and you're like, let's talk about this, you can't say, let's talk about this, super secret thing. And if you're just trying to, well, I saw this story, and if it's out in the public record, then people feel more comfortable. And it's a good sort of baby step to take in the direction of trying to get people more comfortable.
And then one kind of follow up on that, what are the different challenges in trying to get someone to talk to you for something like this, a book, versus the daily paper? And is it easier or harder, or just different? Do people have different motivations for wanting to correct the record and have their story told?
I think there's different motivations, and it's easier and harder in different ways. There are people that I spent hours and hours with for the book that I ended up getting very little, getting nothing out of. There's people that I spent just a little time with that I got a lot out of it. But people, you can sort of tug on their, like, look, this is going to be, lasting. It's going to be something where you can really get into the nuance of things. You can explore things. You can get into detail, and you can really tell a story in a way that the newspaper story, you just can't. I realized while working on the book, the limitations of the newspaper story, or at least the ones that we sort of put on ourselves. I hadn't realized how much the newspaper story and the way that we come at it, and especially the way that I did, like I basically, for much of the Trump era, did sort of like one style of story, which was like, go out, find 1, 2, 3 facts about something sort of important in this investigation, try and do a story off of it, and then just go out and do that again and again and again. And this was a completely, I think I was certainly in my journalism there, I was just kind of like a kind of coming at it just one way. But then when you have a book, it's like there are these different things. It's like, well, I found this really interesting. Like Don McGann's uncle's relationship with Donald Trump is like really, really interesting. Is that a newspaper story? No, maybe not. Maybe it's a line in a newspaper story. Maybe it's a paragraph in a newspaper story. But in terms of trying to set the table to tell the Don McGinn story and to give you a sense of who Donald Trump is in his life, and who Don McGinn is in his life, and where he comes from, and the potential parallels and foreshadowing you can use from that, let's go tell that story for several thousand words.
Well, and since you mentioned it, I actually loved the story of Patty McGinn, Don's uncle. So can you just sort of tell everyone a little bit about that? Because there's just such striking similarities between the two men and their experience with this president.
So when I found this stuff out about Patty McGinn, I just thought I had struck gold in a way that I hadn't in and many other places in the book. So Donald Trump shows up in Atlantic City in like 1980, and he like wants to get in on the burgeoning new casino business. And he needs someone in town who knows how to pull the levers, knows how to get things done. And it's this guy named Patty McGinn. And he brings Patty along, and Patty knows how to do all the tricks and all the things. He can get him, the properties he needs to buy. He can, he knows how to work the locals. He's building connections between buildings. So 2 casinos is only one because you can only own one, and like all sorts of tricks and things like that. And Donald Trump falls in love with this guy. He knows how to do it. Patty, 10-0 with Patty, all this stuff. And then over time, despite all these successes, the relationship starts to deteriorate. And Patty starts to realize that Donald Trump has a different relationship than most people do with the truth. And he starts having to take notes about his conversations with Donald Trump. And he starts having to bring a witness, another lawyer, along with him for his meetings with Trump to document what Trump says. So he'll have him there. Trump then sees his billing records and sees that Patty McGinn is billing him for all of this time, and Trump doesn't like that. And one thing leads to another, and they get into this fight, and then all of a sudden they're in court litigating against each other. And Patty's explaining in depositions that he needed to have witnesses there to protect himself from someone who basically thought was a liar. And when Patty McGinn passes away, I believe around the year 2000, he goes to his grave saying that Donald Trump still owes him $1 million in back legal fees. His nephew drives down from the Republican convention, I think it was in Philadelphia that year, and goes to the burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Fast forward to 2015, Donald Trump needs an elections lawyer, and McGinn actually identifies with Trump and Trumpism in a way that many Washington insiders had not. McGinn had been the head of the FEC, the Election Commission, and he had been a high-profile elections lawyer for Republicans in Washington. But McGinn believed in the roots of Trumpism. He believed in sort of these forgotten people that are left behind by trade deals. He believed that you needed not to run to the middle, but you needed to run to the far right of the base to do that. And McGinn is the kind of guy that identifies with the idea of sort of breaking things. McGinn is this hardened libertarian. He's a little counterintuitive. He was a goalie, an ice hockey goalie. He would take, he's not like a loner, but he kind of did his own thing. He played in these rock bands, and he kind of identifies with Trump. He's not offended by Trump's things, but he convinces himself, even though he knows a little bit about his uncle's relationship with Trump, he convinces himself that he's a different man. This will be a different time. And then in the end, you can see that Don McGann's experience with Donald Trump, while different in many ways, has an enormous amount of similarities to the one that his uncle had.
And going back to your book specifically, in it, you pointedly call Russia's 2016 election meddling an intelligence failure, a September 11th style intelligence failure. Not a lot of people have called it an intelligence failure, and we're not seeing the response that we typically see when there is an intelligence failure, for instance, the 9/11 Commission. But it feels like you do that quite deliberately. And I'm curious, why do you make this distinction, and why do you think it's so important, if you do in fact think it's important?
So 9/11 was clearly an intelligence failure, and the country responded as such. There was a commission that was created to study what happened and to provide recommendations. The federal government essentially sort of remakes a big portion of itself to be a counterterrorism fighting force. And the airports look very different. The police forces across the country look very different. The FBI looks very different. And that was a natural response to a horrific attack on the country in which many people died. Now, I say that what happens in 2016 is probably the largest intelligence failure since 9/11, but it has not gotten that treatment. It's not like Trump came in and said, I'm going to, get Jim Baker from the Republicans and, the equivalent on the Democrat side, and they're going to put together this staff and they're going to have the powers to do what they need to do to get to the bottom of what happened and provide recommendations to the country and to the government in a way that the country can deal with this. As we come into this election, there has been stuff that the intelligence community has done, but there has not been a robust effort to figure out how to deal with a multi-dimensional threat that involves disinformation and hacking and stuff about voter rolls and stuff about emails and all sorts of stuff. And as we come into this election, that the country hasn't gone through that. There's been some stuff to come off of Capitol Hill, but there's no authoritative accounting of it. And even the Mueller investigation, which looked at, essentially looked at whether crimes were committed in connection with the election, doesn't provide, provides the fullest accounting that we know of the election, but it doesn't provide recommendations on how things should be done differently.
And you also write in your book about two top FBI officials who were trying to make the case to the Justice Department during the 2016 election that the Bureau should basically be able to look at the specific contents of flash drives that contained thousands of documents that the Russians had hacked. And ultimately, they're not able to because the Obama administration makes the decision that this is, I believe, privileged information, and they can't look at it. They can sort of code it in broad categories, but they can't read the specifics. I guess I'm curious, do you think had the Obama administration made a different decision, that things might have played out differently? And if so, how?
I don't think it would have fundamentally changed our understanding of what the Russians were going to do in a way that the U.S. could have responded more robustly. The failure on the intelligence side, as far as I can see, is the fact that they didn't understand what was going on the social media side. They didn't have a sense of that. The top people at the FBI had very little idea that this was going on at the time. And on top of that, the intelligence community and the FBI didn't think that all of the hacking the Russians were doing was to weaponize the information. They thought, oh, this is regular espionage. These guys are knocking around servers in Washington and taking a look to know what's going on. Okay, they do that, we do that, normal spy on spy games. It's the weaponization, it's taking the emails and it's dumping them out there the way that they did. That's the game changer. That's the thing that makes this different. And there was no intelligence, no ability to know that and to respond. Now, look, the 2016, the meddling in the 2016 election is so vast and complex. I'm not sure that even if you knew in real time, you would be able to respond in a way that was really be able to stop it. But certainly the government was flat-footed in an incredible way.
And obviously another theme of your book is the question of obstruction of justice. And I think when I or the average person thinks of obstruction of justice, you think of someone doing something covertly or secretly, but you kind of write about the sheer brazenness of how Trump basically directly asks Comey to let the Flynn matter go. And I'm curious, do you think the fact that the president was sort of so shameless about it and very much did it so out in the open in a lot of ways that it made it harder to name as what some people believed that it was? Like what challenge did that pose?
I think that it's sort of the unusualness of Trump in the way that he tests all of us, the way that he tests us in the media, the way that he tests tested law enforcement, the way he just tests everything. He's testing the FBI in a way that it doesn't really know exactly how to respond and what it's seeing. I'm pretty sure that Comey would say that when he asked him then the Flynn investigation, he's pretty clear that he's trying to obstruct justice. But when the president is doing that, it's such an atypical way for the government to be functioning. And I think one of the failures that the FBI has, it doesn't open this investigation on Trump until after Comey's fired. And I think that there's a delay there because it's the president of the United States. and they're not sure what to do. And I get that. I get that that's a really big monumental decision. But Comey's trying to get Rod Rosenstein on board at the Justice Department, so he has an ally across the street, and he thinks he's got time. I mean, this is the thing that I found interesting about both these characters. Comey thinks he's got time. He thinks he's going to be there for 10 years because the norm of having an FBI director with a 10-year term is something that, Trump wouldn't be able to survive firing the FBI director. Why would and Trump wouldn't do that? That'd be crazy. Why would he do that? People would go crazy. Comey thinks he's got time on the clock up until the point that he's fired.
Then a few quick questions before I turn to questions about sort of your book and the process. One is, I understand you considered renaming, coming up with a new title, basically after your book was done. So what were you trying to do with the title, and what was the alternate title?
So naming, like everything with the book, naming the book was hard. I mean, everything with the book was hard, but naming the book was particularly hard. And I constantly was grasping for sort of the modern day Washington equivalent of Barbarians at the Gate. And I thought about all different sorts of things. And, originally one of the titles was Obstructing Trump. But I thought that I didn't like that for certain reasons. I didn't like it, whatever. And eventually we come to Donald Trump versus the United States. And then we add on in the days after sort of settling on that, inside the struggle to stop a president, because I thought that Donald Trump versus the United States didn't say enough about what the book was. And if you were going to take the unusual construction of Donald Trump versus the United States in the sense that it looks like a court case, and I think you needed to give the reader more guidance on what this book was about and what you were going to tackle. And then I thought about Inside the Struggle to Stop a President. At first I liked it and then I hated it and whatever. But I never found that title that I was really grasping for. I never loved this title, and I never came up with it. And then after the title was done and the jacket was done, and basically the whole project was coming to an end, I was doing some fact checking at the end, and I find out that John Kelly would refer to the instances in which they had to go in to tell Trump he couldn't do something, that he didn't have the power to do it, or it was a bad idea, or the typical, the central thing that I'm talking about, like how do you contain a president? How do you? He said he's basically describing the struggle to stop a president. Kelly would say, to the folks around him, he says, let's go French kiss the chainsaw. And French kissing, talking about how they were French kissing the chainsaw. And to me, I was like, aha. I was like that in some really stark, poetic, but some pretty stark terms. Very
evocative.
What?
It's very evocative.
Evocative, yes, that's a better way of saying it. In these evocative terms, that explains the struggle to stop a president. To go in and tell Donald Trump he can't do something is like French kissing a chainsaw. So can we, I was thinking, can we rename the book, French Kissing the Chainsaw, Inside the Struggle to Stop Donald Trump? I think some people would have been put off by it, but it would have had that sort of, wrenching feeling to it that I had searched for, and that I think I ultimately never got to.
And then I want to read the last line of your book and have a question about that. So your book ends, the epilogue ends, you write, the president had bent Washington to his will. So first, for people who haven't heroically made it to the end of your book like I have, can you tell us what specifically you are referring to? And then secondly, a bit more existentially, at what cost did he bend Washington to his will? And is your sense that it's elastic, it can bounce back, bend back, or is this a more permanent shift we've seen?
Well, I'm flattered you got that far. And
it's a great book. It was easy to get that far, but
there we go. That's good. In terms of the like what the legacy or what is the impact of Trump, I had been convinced in the first few years of the administration that Trump is just this incredibly abnormal politician, and whoever comes in, whether it's a more typical Republican president or Democratic president, Washington's just going to snap back. That Washington will just kind of snap back into place. I'm less convinced about that today, because I think that sometimes when you see the way that the machine of government or politics can be used in ways that you didn't think they could be used, my guess is that people will want to do that, and that Trump's abnormal use of power, as I sort of describe it in the book, has shown people that there's a lot more that they can get away with than they thought they could. So I'm less convinced today that it will snap back than ever before. And my sense is that, especially based on what comes of Trump, we're going to be looking at this question of what Trump meant for the rest of our lives. It'll be one of sort of this enduring things. Look, if everything goes back to sort of normal, maybe it'll be less interesting, but maybe it's a harbinger of things to come. I just think it looks, at least, it's hard to know where the pivot points in history are, but it certainly feels highly unusual. So I think we'll be living through this era and trying to understand it for a long time. And maybe it'll be interesting to see, like, maybe I had some views in the book that, I'll look back in 5 or 10 years and say, well, I had that completely wrong. Maybe in the same way that I thought in the first few years that Washington would snap back. In terms of Trump bending his will to Washington, what I'm trying to say is that on that 26th day of the administration, when Trump asked Comey to end the Flynn investigation, Comey was never going to do that. And when we learn about that, when I write the story about that just a couple of months later in May of 2017, and Mueller was appointed the next day, the disclosure of that was so jarring. The idea that the president asked the FBI director to end the investigation to his national security advisor was such a big deal and so earth-shattering that Mueller's appointed, and there's a real feeling of something highly unusual is going on, and it's widely condemned, by people from both parties, and it was a sort of a pivot point in the administration. So fast forward to the spring of this year, and Bill Barr goes to court, and on behalf of the Justice Department, asked the judge overseeing the Flynn case, Flynn at that point still had not been sentenced, to throw out the Flynn investigation, to throw out the Flynn plea, and essentially end the Flynn investigation. And to me, here Trump he was trying on the 26th day of his administration to end this investigation. He searched around for someone to do it for 3-4 more years, and he finally had found that person, and his own Justice Department had gone to court and asked the court to do that, something that Comey never would have done. So to me, that was a great example of how Trump had bent Washington to it as well.
And then 2 final quick questions, and I'll then go to reader questions. The first is, I assume a lot of people who are watching Mike here are fans of his also on MSNBC, and we are all wondering why you always wear a half zip or a full zip, and what you know about fashion that we don't.
Ooh, ouch.
No, I'm serious.
I saw something many years ago where someone said that they wore a uniform, and I think a little bit before the Trump era, I started wearing the same thing every day, and I think into the Trump era, basically was wearing jeans, a button-down white shirt, and what at the time was a black zipper thing that went all the way up, because I actually get very cold pretty easily, especially inside, especially in DC in the air conditioning. So like I can't sit at my desk with just a button-down shirt. Like I need like something else to wear on top of it. So I started wearing these things, and then it just became easy, and it was like we just wear the same thing every day, just a bunch of white shirts and 2 black zipper ups, and jeans and the same pair of shoes or sneakers. And so I just fell into that, and then folks that love me have upgraded it to a more nicer version of what I had before, and the sort of the Lululemon version of it is gone. This is more of a sweater, but it's the same thing. I'm cold. I'm sitting here right now, and I'm cold.
And then ending this part on a serious note, you dedicate the book to your cousin, John Taylor Schmidt III, who was born, you write, just 19 days before you. Can you just tell us a little bit about him and why you dedicated the book to him?
So he was the first great grandchild of my father's grandmother, and he, you know, I knew him when I was a baby, and then when he graduated from high school, us being the same age, he went and joined the Marines. I hadn't seen him in many years after, when we were babies, and then I spent a year in Iraq in 2011, and I walked away from that experience with a much deeper appreciation of you know, of life, I guess, life in general. And I had gone to his funeral in 2005, and I think that you know, we're part of the same generation of people, and that there's a lot of folks in my generation that paid an enormous price in these wars that we fought after 9/11. And I thought that it's very easy for them to be forgotten, and that if I did this, that it would be harder, and there'd be some way for his name. I mean, his name will live on in other ways, but this would be another way for that to happen. So that's why I did.
And I'm going to turn to the questions in the Q&A. Obviously, people can add more. It looks like some of them, it's like a Reddit, they get rated. So I'm just going to start with some of the ones on top. So someone, Ralph Serpa asks, all White Houses leak. Help us understand the mechanism of how a White House staffer would spill the beans to you, a reporter. Slip you a note, a coded message after too much to drink. How would it work?
Sort of a really, really hard question that I always struggle to answer. It's like, how do we get the information that we do? Just talking to people. It's just that easy. I don't know, you answer that question. How do you do it?
I'm just going to go on to another question.
I mean, reporting is this thing where you basically come up to a situation, you try and get to know the people there and get them to tell you about what's going on inside, in a way that that you can get the information for them, and
Well, let me go out of order briefly with a related but slightly different question that might be easier to answer. And I'm going out of order because I happen to see a question from my wonderful 9-year-old stepdaughter downstairs on the second floor, who asks, what advice would you give to a young person who has hopes of being a reporter? Any tips or tricks?
I think that you have to have a deep desire. You have to have that part of you that really wants the story. And it's the kind of thing, Michael Gordon, who used to be a reporter at the Times, once said this. He said, the great part about journalism is that if you're willing to work harder than the person next to you, you will usually get the story, and you will do better than the others. And it is truly true in journalism that if you put in the time, whether it's to get to know people, or it's to study a subject, or to work on your writing or anything, you will get better. And I'd say to anyone starting, there's a pretty neat part to it, that if you are willing to outwork the folks around you, you can do it. And it's, you know, you don't need special talents. They can help, but a lot of it is the willingness to work really, really hard. And if you can do that, then you can really accomplish things.
And then going back to more traditional order, someone asks, do you think Comey regrets what he did to Hillary? That's obviously a slightly loaded way of phrasing that question, but I think you understand it. Does he have any regrets maybe of how the whole thing played out?
I think that if you were to ask Jim Comey that question, what he would say is that based on the information that he had at the time, on what he thought had been uncovered. Let's just take the reopening of the Clinton email investigation in October of 2016. He would say that if he had the same information, he would make the same decision again. And that if you tried to get into a thought experiment with him where you said, well, Donald Trump would be elected president if you did that, and the things that you care so deeply about, like the independence of the FBI, would be obliterated and you would be fired. He would say, well, do I also get to know that that if I reopen the investigation, the FBI is going to be able to figure out within just a matter of days that there's nothing there, and that we're not going to have to go ahead and charge Hillary Clinton with something. So I don't think that. I think that if you're Jim Comey, it's very wounding to go through that entire experience, to be blamed by a significant portion of the country for the election of Trump, and then to be blamed by another portion of the country for undermining Donald Trump's presidency. But Comey carried an Emerson quote around with him when he was a kid that basically said that, the trueness in the world is to do what you think is right and not what other people think is right. And my guess is that he takes some strength from that.
And then another question. Journalists refer to the Trump administration as leaky. In your experience, is this administration staff more eager to leak to the press than prior administrations?
Totally. Totally. And we have more insight into this administration and what goes on inside of it than, it's not even like, it's like exponentially larger than any other presidency. And especially like the Obama presidency. There was a story in the Times a couple of weeks or months ago about Obama, and it had like one fact in it about like Obama thought something, or Obama, Obama may have thought something, and it was like, oh my gosh, like with Trump, it's like you have three, I call them stupid human tricks, which is highly unusual things that he did, that just like story after story after story after story and insights, and in a sense, and I don't know how much this will hold up, but like I had an opportunity to write about a White House counsel and what a White House counsel did, and understand and how he advised the president. And because of the Mueller investigation and because of documents that have come out and all sorts of things, we have these insight into like what a White House counsel does in ways that certainly I didn't have before, to see how the lawyer at the White House advises the president on the president's authorities. So in a sense, it's revealing in ways, and you can learn from it in ways that certainly in other more opaque administrations you can't.
This is a question, again, revealing my biases, from my colleague, I guess your competitor, Phil Rucker, who has a great book out himself that I also recommend everyone buy, Very Stable Genius. I guess I'm going off message here. But the question is, you delivered scoop after scoop while coming under relentless assault by the President of the United States and senior government officials, calling your outlet, the failing New York Times, and your stories fake news. Was there ever a moment that the attacks got to you personally, and what inspired you to stay motivated to do your job every day and uncover the truth regardless of the hostility from the White House?
Well, Phil can answer that. Phil can answer that question too.
But he wants you to answer it now, Mike.
You can answer that question. I took an enormous amount of strength in this process from my relationship with Maggie Haberman. I have a great admiration for who she is and her ability to function in this administration, the fact that she so selflessly threw herself at this story, and the fact that she one day, the left hates her one day, the right hates her another, and she has a true ability, I think, to call balls and strikes on things and to get to the real root of a problem in a way that I just think is so admirable. So I hitched my car to Maggie as soon as I could, and relied on her and leaned in to working with her as much as possible, because if there was anything being said about me, there was always people going after Maggie worse than me. We once had this experience where they wanted us to answer some questions in a Reddit, and it was a way of seeing how people were going after her and targeting her. Readers were. And I said, Maggie's got it a lot worse than us. And if she can do it, then the rest of us can do it. And I just think that she's just a great example of someone that has worked under that pressure. So I just tried to learn from her.
And then another question is basically, she asks, do you think our collective desensitization to the crazy will diminish over time? I guess you talked about that a little with if Washington bends back, but.
I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. It's like things that are going on today are so, the story just continues to go and go and go and go. And it's hard to get excited is not the right word, but sort of jarred by this story. There was that story today by The Atlantic about what Trump said in France a couple of years ago when he was going to visit the cemetery, these pretty awful comments about American service members. That stuck out at me. And I was like, wow, that's really significant. Is it that different than things that we've heard him say in the past? It's worse. It's worse and it's bad, but he's also, there's a lot of other, awful things that he said that have come out. So I don't know. And I think that certainly by the end of this, I'm sort of desensitized because it's like, what's a big story at this point? And I often think back to the early days of the Comey firing. I'm like, that story just kind of plays itself out. It's just that was the first one. That was the first test. Was this guy going to bend? And he wasn't. And he gets fired, and it's a gigantic mess. But there's so many other gigantic messes that have come since then, and characters that have come.
And Carol asks, what are the 2 to 3, but I guess in the interest of getting to more questions, maybe just 2, takeaways from your book and research, particularly looking forward? She also asks if Trump should be reelected, but I won't put you on the spot for that.
This may not be a direct answer to that, but what I tried to capture in the book was this phenomenon, which I don't really have a name for, but it's basically standing between the president and the abyss. So we have studied how presidents use their power for most of American history, how the people around them help them do that, what that says about the president, the moment, the country. In this case, because of Trump's abnormal behavior, we get to see what it's like for the people around the president to try and stop him. And if you're the FBI director or you're the White House counsel, you're the same thing as the 911 operator. There's no other FBI director or White House counsel to call. There's no other 911 operator to call. You are the thing standing in the way. And what is that like, to stand toe-to-toe with the president and to try and stop the president from doing something? And what does that reveal about you? What does that tell about you? And what does that tell about the moment? Because I just think, to me, that was something that, I'm sure some of it went on in Nixon. I'm sure some of it goes on in every administration. But we had this view into that. And what is that human experience like? Don McGinn and Jim Comey are human beings who had to go through this. What did that feel like? What did that look like? And what can we learn from that? And that's what I set out to try and do.
That makes sense. And do you buy into the speculation that Trump will refuse to leave the White House if he's not reelected?
I think that Donald Trump has done nothing according to the book or by convention on many major things. So I think that we have to keep that level, keep that in the back of our heads as we look at anything, because whether it's you can't fire the FBI director because he's supposed to have a 10-year term, or it's you're supposed to criticize foreign adversaries that target your troops. He's not hewed to those norms. So I don't know. I think you have to wonder, will he continue? Like, why would he hew to certain norms if he hasn't hewed to others?
And I'll end on what seems to be a kind of feel-good team question. It's from someone who says they're reading your book now, and they also watched the Showtime documentary on the New York Times. when it aired. It says you're doing these very highly scrutinized and very contentious stories that you're doing both on your own and with longtime friends on the Russia team like Mark Mazzetti and Adam Goldman. And the question is, how was that experience having editors and, hold on, just going down the line, one second, having editors and fellow reporters, both as friends, as colleagues, as the people responsible for making sure these stories were as airtight as possible, both for you personally and the group? What is that dynamic like?
I would say, and especially with Goldman and Mazzetti, those are two people that, I think I've been through the ringer with. They're the kind of people where I can close my eyes on the basketball court and I'm going to know where they are. And I don't have to think twice about it. And I know, I trust them implicitly. And it has been an incredibly, in terms of friendship and camaraderie, the Trump story has been something that has brought me closer to, just those two people and Maggie I was mentioning earlier, in ways that, I think will stick with me for the rest of my life. I have the same thing I spent a year in Iraq, and there was Jack Healy and Tim Marengo from the times that I spent there. I don't see Tim or Jack at all, but I share that experience with them in ways that that if I saw them, that I have an affinity and admiration for them that is just incredible. I never got to become a professional baseball player and have teammates, but those are my teammates, and it's people I really love. So.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to do this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Michael and Ashley, for really engaging discussion. The more that gets revealed about Trump's abnormal use of power and the efforts to stop him, the more astonishing it all appears. And Michael, your book adds much to deepen our understanding. Again, the title of Michael's book is Donald Trump versus the United States. And all of you watching can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that's posted in the chat column. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.